go. Take it away, Katrina.
Okay, great. Thanks. I'm enthusiastic and grateful to be here with you today. Thanks so much for joining us. I became connected to the CCCE through the Family Caregivers of British Columbia in November last year, when the CCCE released their white paper. And since then, I've become integrated into their amazing work, including being the co-chair of the Canadian Caregivers Advisory Network, Caregivers CAN. Today, I'm joining you from the city of Vancouver, which is located within the shared, unceded ancestral territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh Nations. Executive Director Liv Mendelsohn will now do the land acknowledgement on behalf of the CCCE.
Welcome, everyone. And thank you for joining us today and bearing with us as we get started with some technical fun, which is the way everything starts at this time. So thank you to Katrina, who has been an absolutely tremendous supporter and caregiver activist. And we're very pleased to have her co-chairing our Caregivers CAN network of thousands of caregivers across the country. Our offices at CCCE are located in Toronto and Toronto on the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, including the Mississauga of the Credit, Haudenosaunee, and Huron-Wendat. This land has been governed by Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt for 1,000 years, and in more recent times by Williams Treaty and Treaty 13. And we believe that all people living in Canada are treaty people. We are all part of a relationship based on respect, cooperation, partnership, and recognition of Indigenous rights. At CCCE, we take this very seriously, both in our support of and co-design with Indigenous communities. And we are always learning with and from Indigenous caregivers and care providers.
Thank you, Liv, for the acknowledgement. I'll tell you a little bit about myself. I've been really a lifelong caregiver. Maybe I didn't realize that at first, but now looking back, I realize that very clearly. It started most likely with my grandfather. When I was 6, he lost his vision, and I started helping him with day-to-day tasks, moving around the town, and I supported my grandmother with those tasks, and I learned quite a lot at a very young age about caregiving. I left Vancouver and I was gone for many years, and when my grandmother was getting on, I came back to Vancouver to support my mom in caregiving for my grandma. My grandma lived to be 98, so there was many, many years of caregiving for my grandma, who also was wonderful and taught me a lot. Soon after my grandmother passed, my mom was diagnosed with dementia, and I took on the full-time caregiver role for her. That ended about a year ago when she passed. I did keep mom at home for the whole time, and it was a massive undertaking. As any caregiver knows, caregiving is challenging. She did pass on her 71st birthday, so she was quite young. And I still advocate and speak on behalf of caregivers. It's time for some shifts, and I'm really grateful that the CCCE is making those shifts in the system. I've learned a lot about caregiving, the system, the stigmas, and the many challenges caregivers are presented with daily. I've also learned that there's a lot of space for joy and connection, especially when caregivers are set up for success. So thank you to the CCCE for supporting that. They bring new hope to caregivers through inclusion, advocacy, and recognition that we desperately need. Before we jump into today's presentation by Liv and James, I'm pleased to introduce the Honourable Ya'ara Saks, Federal MP for York Centre. Ya'ara Saks is the Member of Parliament for York Centre in Toronto. As a longtime community advocate and Bathurst Manor resident, she is committing to making life better for families in York Centre. Before her election in 2020, Ya'ara was a successful small business owner and a strong advocate for better access to mental health services as a founder and director of Trauma Practice for Healthy Communities, a Toronto-based mental health charity. In Parliament, Ya'ara serves as the Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Families, Children and Social Development, and sits as a member of the House of Commons Standing Committee on Access to Information, Privacy, and Ethics. She is a member of the Canada-Israel and Canada-Italy interparliamentary groups and Canada-Philippines and Canada-Jordan parliamentary friendship groups. Ya'ara is also the mother of 2 teenage daughters. Welcome, Ya'ara. Thanks so much for being here with us today.
Thank you so much, Katrina, and thank you for the brief introduction on sort of the formal things that I do in my life as both the member of Parliament and the Parliamentary Secretary to Families, Children, and Social Development. I just want to lean in before we start to the land acknowledgement a little bit that Liv shared with us, because I think it's really important. I also am speaking to you from Toronto, from the unceded territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Huron-Wendat, and Haudenosaunee, and many other First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples. But I'd like to, I was taught when I was up in the Yukon last year that when we do land acknowledgements, it's about personal reflection of where we are and who we are in the land that we sit in. And I just want to acknowledge that the lands that we sit in, no matter where we are, they're a place that we derive joy from, live in, raise our families in, and care for our elders. And I think that's really important in terms of the discussion that we're having today about caregiving. Our Indigenous peoples teach us so much about what it means to care for and learn from the elders in our communities. And it's something that we can reflect on as we have our discussions today, what it means to learn from our elders, but also understanding that caring for them. And also there's a wonderful tradition in Indigenous communities of looking 7 generations forward. Of how do we care for ourselves and those who will come after us. And we learn that from the ones who come before us. And so as we start today's conversations and we acknowledge the lands that we sit on and the learnings and the inclusivity of our First Nations communities that are really part of our lives here in Canada, we have so much to learn from and share with them as we go on this journey of caregiving together. It's really a pleasure to be here with all of you and the team of the Canadian Centre for Caregiving and Canadian Centre for Caregiving Excellence as we celebrate their 1st anniversary. So what many of you may not know is that I had the fortunate pleasure of meeting with James and Liv early on in the center's inception. And we had such important and amazing conversations. I was blown away by the mission and really understanding the need to support caregivers and care providers in Canada today. And as we go forward, we have a growing aging population in this country. And knowing that we can work together to make Canada a place where Canadians really receive and are able to give the care that Canadians deserve with dignity and compassion and really with love is something that is so central to the work of the center. And I was excited when we started to talk about this last year. As Katrina shared, all of us will give care or need care at some point in our lives, whether it's loved ones, neighbors, family members that we know, but this is care work that's largely unseen. Katrina, you sharing that from a young age, you started to learn this. You saw yourself in that role, but maybe perhaps others did not. And this is really an important part of being seen in what the role of caregivers have and is mostly unacknowledged across the country. The lack of support and increasing demands for care, coupled with a shortage of care providers, has meant that many caregivers, old and young, and care providers, old and young, are doing more than ever before, and it leads to a deterioration of mental health and the overall feelings of burnout that we've heard from across the country, both during the pandemic and since then. I know for me, I became a caregiver during the pandemic to my dad, who contracted COVID, and being in a role where emotionally so close, yet physically having to be so far, and in a role where decisions had to be made and not being able to look into the eyes of my own dad as we discussed what was needed for him was something that really raised awareness for me of how do we create compassionate spaces for care for those who are going through what they're going through, but also those who care for them. And that's why the work of the center is so important now. A national voice advocating for caregivers and care providers is really essential. And the Canadian Centre for Caregiving Excellence has made significant strides in elevating the conversation at a national level in their first year. And it's something that I've been involved in this conversation and many others. And you have so much to be proud of in doing that work. Caregiving is really the next frontier in public policy in Canada. And the release of the CCCE policy white paper, Giving Care, launched this national conversation about the importance of protecting all of those who provide care, young and old. And I can tell you that from a federal perspective, certainly in the many hats that I wear as both an MP and the Parliamentary Secretary for Families and Children, the conversations around care and the care economy are happening more than ever before. And in no small part, thanks to you guys. And so in addition to the advocacy work in the past year, the center has supported an impressive number of programs and initiatives that will help fill important gaps in knowledge for caregivers in underserved areas across the country and provide much needed wellness and education opportunities for caregivers as well. You're going to hear today about the specific details of these programs in a few minutes. And when I hand the floor back to Liv and to James, who have so much to talk about with you today. The programs and initiatives and advocacy efforts are really important in creating the meaningful impact for caregivers and care providers that so many of you are looking for, both on the national stage, the provincial stage, and in your own communities. So I hope you're all really proud of the work you've accomplished in the first year. Your work is really remarkable, and caregivers are so lucky to have you elevating their voices and championing the change that we know we need. I'm proud to be a friend and ally of the CCCE, and I look forward to all that we can accomplish together. So congratulations to all of you, and I will hand the floor back to Liv.
Thank you so much, Ya'ara. Ya'ara has been a real champion for caregivers long before our inception, and a real partner as we develop this work and really create a multi-partisan pan-Canadian, as James will tell you all about, coalition. Ya'ara's leadership in that has been invaluable, and her guidance has been really, really welcome. So thank you so much, and it's great to celebrate with you today.
Ya'ara, thanks so much for being here today. I really appreciate your words and reflections. And I agree that the CCCE's accomplishments in the first year have certainly been remarkable and has filled a very important gap in advocacy for caregivers and care providers. There's still a lot of work to do, and we are hopeful to see tangible actions taken by all levels of government to support people who give care. Next, we're going to hear from CCCE's Liv Mendelsohn and James Janeiro. Liv is the Executive Director of the Canadian Centre for Caregiving Excellence, where she leads innovation, research, policy, and program initiatives to support Canada's caregivers and care providers. Liv has been a lifelong caregiver and has lived experience of disability. Her experience as a member of the sandwich generation has fueled her passion to build a caregiver movement in Canada to change the way that caregiving is seen, valued, and supported. Over the course of her career, Liv has founded and helmed several organizations in the disability and caregiving space, including the Wagner Green Center for Accessibility and Inclusion and the Real Abilities Toronto Film Festival. Liv serves as the chair of the City of Toronto Accessibility Advisory Committee. She has received the City of Toronto Equity Award and has been recognized by University College, University of Toronto, and the Jewish Community Centers of North America for her leadership. Liv is a senior fellow at Massey College and a graduate of the Mandel Institute for Nonprofit Leadership and the Civic Action Leadership Foundation Diversity Fellowship Program. Liv, amazing. Thank you. And
thank you, Katrina. I'm excited to share with you a little bit about the year that was and the year that is to come. As Katrina mentioned, I am a caregiver. I was born into a caregiving role. My grandmother lived with us when I was born, and at first she took care of us as children, and then we took care of her. And I am currently a parent of 2 amazing neurodiverse kids and a caregiver to my dad as well as he ages. So my caregiving has truly been across the lifespan as a young caregiver, spanning aging and disability. And Katrina mentioned the sandwich generation. I remember my mother talking about being a member of the sandwich generation when she was in her 40s and 50s. So, the crunch around care has been ongoing for a long time, and it really is overdue for some creative solutions and some policy solutions. So I'm going to take you through our first year, our inception, our priorities, our values, and which pathways and solutions we see as the way forward together. We can go to the next slide. There we go. So the Canadian Centre for Caregiving Excellence is an arm of and embedded within the Azrieli Foundation, which is a large philanthropic foundation here in Canada, who have long been involved in supporting disability community. So even before the pandemic, there was a real recognition that caregivers and care providers needed more support, and that we needed a more systemic and structural solution to some of the problems in care. The foundation met with stakeholders across the country, and what emerged was the need for a center of excellence to conduct research, gather data, share resources, and really to create a national network so people could share best practices, better understand care across the country, partner together, and for this center to support and fund excellence and to advocate for policy solutions. The pandemic, as we know, accelerated the crisis in care and really revealed a lot of the gaps in our systems from coast to coast to coast. So the launch of the center really was timely in that there was national attention on the crisis in care, but the work that went into it long predated the launch. So from our inception, we've really been a co-design organization. When we were launching, we met with more than 120 stakeholders across the country, in every part of the country, and held focus groups and design sessions with caregivers, care providers, heads of various agencies in social and healthcare, and researchers and policymakers. And MP Saks was one of those policymakers. So she's been with us from the very beginning. Next slide. We came together through this co-design work and through listening to community to this vision. Our hope and what we intend, not just hope, but intend to see, is a Canada leading the way in quality care, where caregiving is valued, caregivers are supported, and people accessing care are central to policies and practices. That's our North Star. It guides all the work that we do. Next slide. Our mission, also a result of bringing together in many co-design sessions and distilling the wisdom of caregivers, care providers, and professionals across the country, is a center that supports and empowers caregivers and care providers, advances the knowledge and capacity of the caregiving field, and advocates for effective and visionary social policy with a disability-informed lens. Next slide. Our values, I think, are values that undergird most community work, but I'm going to highlight, I've already spoken a little bit about co-design. I'm going to highlight interdependence. We truly believe that the triad in care, the caregiver, the care provider, and the care recipient, or the person who accesses care, are all interdependent. And the care recipient does not do well if the caregiver and care provider are not doing well. So we need to support all three angles in that triangle. Next slide, please. So our work breaks down into 4 large buckets: support networks and knowledge sharing, supporting them, convening them, establishing them, both regionally, locally, and across the country; advocacy and policy development, which James will speak to shortly; education and leadership development, both for caregivers and care providers. As Katrina can tell you, nobody trains you to be a caregiver. So there are a lot of skills in service navigation, but also practical skills in support, in feeding, in communicating, in caring, in advocating for the person that you love, that caregivers need to learn and need to be supported to learn, and in leadership development for care providers. And we'll talk a little bit more about that as well. And particularly in filling gaps and identifying needs in underserved communities. That's central to our mission. Next slide, please. We really believe this. Canada is a nation of caregivers. 1 in 4 Canadians is a caregiver today. We know that by 2030, it will be 1 in 2. So every family is a caregiving family. Everybody in Canada is connected to a web of care. Next slide, please. So we'll give you a very brief snapshot on caregivers in Canada. And this is fairly recent data. This is 2022. 8 million plus Canadians are family caregivers, and that's only a measure of Canadians age 15 plus. So we know the numbers of young caregivers are undercounted, and they're actually far more. Canadian caregivers provide an average of 19 hours a week of care, and the number, of course, will go up based on the care needs of the care recipient. If there are complex care needs, even more. So that is a part-time job, for some a full-time job, and it is invisible, unseen work most of the time. Canadians provide 5.7 billion hours of unpaid care per year, and that's equivalent to 32.2% of national healthcare spending. That is a statistic that I think is jaw-dropping, and again, is not known or understood. And the challenges for caregivers, so caregivers in our parlance being family, friends, neighbors, chosen family who take on an unpaid care role. What we've heard about the most is loss of income from having to take time off work or reduce work hours, loss of employment, loss of benefits. If you're not working, you're not paying into the Canadian pension plan, for instance. Relentless demands, lack of respite supports, burnout, stress, and stress-related illnesses. So these are just some of the challenges. Next slide. And for care providers, so in our parlance, the people who are paid to do the work of care, so folks like personal support workers, disability support providers, home health aides, sometimes called the direct care workforce. They work in a variety of settings, from personal homes, group homes, supported apartments, independent living housing, long-term care, and more. We know that they are largely racialized and newcomer women with few protections and unclear pathways to advancement. We know that 50% of them leave this type of work within 5 years of beginning. There is an uneven training and certification landscape, high turnover and workforce shortages, 25% shortage across Canada in developmental support workers and personal support workers right now. And what we've learned through talking with care providers across the country is that although our health and social care systems are very siloed, in fact, care providers work across those silos and in many different systems, so that one worker can work a PSW shift in the morning, a DSW shift in the evening, and a home care shift on the weekend. So these are folks who we depend on most to care for people who are important to us, and yet they are underpaid, undervalued, and that needs to change. Next slide. Oop, I think we're going back one. Just making sure we are on the right slide. I think I'm going to wait till we're on the right side. Here we go. So that's where we were, and one more forward. Thank you. We are working to transform the system for a brighter, and it should say systems, I think, for a brighter future of care and building a caregiving movement together. And that is the critical work that we're doing at CCCE. Next slide, please. Again, all of our work is underscored by and built through co-design and lived expertise. We've set up a number of different groups and tables. Our Caregivers CAN advisory network, which Katrina co-chairs, which is made up of caregivers with lived experience from coast to coast to coast, truly from the Yukon to, the East Coast to Victoria and everything in between. Our direct support professional fellows who are care providers from across the country. Our advisory council, which is made up of leaders and experts from across the country. Our Young Caregivers Roundtable, which has more than 20 agencies supporting young caregivers. Our Caregiving Across the Lifespan community of practice, which brings together groups like Canadian Cancer Society, Heart and Stroke Foundation, Diabetes, Alzheimer's, Inclusion Canada, March of Dimes, lots of large, important organizations supporting people who receive care to look at what we have in common, which is care recipients and care providers and caregivers. And our Working Caregivers Initiative, which brings together employers, caregivers who are working and in post-secondary education to look at how we can create caregiver-friendly workplace policies. Next slide, please. So one of the things that we know is that while we're putting together all of these networks and funding and convening and building a better future, caregivers and care providers need support right now. We already talked about burnout a little bit and really the mental health crisis for both caregivers and care providers through COVID and now ongoing. In partnership with CAMH, with Queens, and with our own Siblings Canada, we've offered more than 20 free wellness programs, ACT therapy, PACT groups, 6-week mindfulness programs, all of which are demonstrably making a difference in people's capacity to cope, but also to thrive while giving care. And notably with McGill, we're focusing on the needs of bereaved caregivers. What happens after the person you are supporting is no longer with us? What happens to the caregiver? Because that's been a significant gap and a serious site of mental health challenges as well. Next slide, please. Supporting underserved community. We already saw communities. We already saw a question in the Q&A about this, and this is both close to our hearts and essential work because in as much as all caregivers have been underserved by our current policies, we know that there are specific barriers that many groups face. One example of the kinds of work that we're funding is in Nunavut. We are working with an Indigenous-led organization to gather knowledge about needs of caregivers in all 25 communities across the territory. And that will be used both to better provide services and to share briefing and advocacy with the government for the needs of caregivers, the needs of elders, and of people with disabilities. We're better understanding the needs of Francophone caregivers in minority communities. This has been identified as another huge gap. If you're a Francophone living outside Quebec, it can be very hard to access services and supports. So together with our friends at L'Appui pour les proches aidants, we are conducting a survey, creating a community of practice across the country in New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, Manitoba, Ontario, and beyond. and sharing resources and adopting resources that come from Francophone services in Quebec for services outside. And we are supporting grassroots Indigenous caregiving groups. We are supporting mostly in Alberta to date, and research on caregiving in Indigenous communities at the University of Alberta, and really learning with and from the folks at Indigenous Disability Canada as well. So if you have more questions about some of the kinds of projects we're engaging in, you can let us know in the Q&A. Next slide. Supporting care providers is one of our core pieces of work. We established the Canadian Leadership Institute for Developmental Services, a sector where 70% of the leadership will be retiring within the next 10 years. So we really want to make sure that that sector has great leadership, and that there's a career ladder from support worker to supervisor to manager to leadership, and that there's real opportunities in that sector. So 40 emerging leaders were trained, and 40 more will be trained, and an active community of practice is continuing. And we have our Care Provider Fellowship Program to share knowledge, needs, and advocacy goals, and to really inform our understanding of what's happening on the ground in communities, in newcomer communities, in communities of caregivers across the country. Care providers across the country. Next slide, please. Research and advocacy. Part of wanting to support excellence is understanding what excellence can look like. We funded 12 grants in research, education, and knowledge exchange, and we have a large new partnership that we just launched with the Canadian Institute for Health Research to catalyze research and care over the next 5 years. There'll be quite a few grants that are specific to care. And so we are able to leverage our center and our funding to really, as I said, catalyze new research in an area that is underexplored. We do lots of in-house research focusing on sibling caregivers through Siblings Canada, which is an initiative within the center. And we're doing some great work right now in partnership with Queens and Western, better understanding the needs of sibling caregivers who are demographically the next big wave of caregivers. We released our first national white paper, which James will talk about. We are building a caregiving caucus, and we're learning from our partners in the US, UK, South Korea, Ireland, Germany, Singapore, and more. Next slide, please. I'm going to turn it over to James, but first I'm going to let Katrina introduce James to you.
Thanks, Liv. And it's always staggering to hear the stats, and inspiring to hear what the CCCE has accomplished and is continuing to work on. So thank you so much for that presentation. James Janeiro is the CCCE's Director of Policy and Government Relations. James Janeiro has over a decade of experience in politics, policy, and government relations. As a Director of Policy and Government Relations at CCCE, James leads an ambitious national and pan-Canadian advocacy and policy development agenda focused on substantive and practical reform. He began his career in the Ontario Public Service, working on disability legislation. He then transitioned to the political policy space and served 2 successive Ontario Ministers of Community and Social Services as a senior policy advisor on social assistance, poverty, disability, and veterans issues. In 2014, James assumed a new role serving Premier Kathleen Wynne as her social policy advisor. In this position, he was responsible for a diverse array of policy areas, including poverty reduction, housing, the basic income pilot program, disability issues, autism services, and municipal affairs. In 2018, James left government for a senior role in the nonprofit sector. He was Director of Community Engagement and Policy at Community Living Toronto from 2018 to 2022. In this role, James developed and executed advocacy strategies focused on housing, income security, and service improvement. He holds an honors BA in political science, history, and languages, and a master's in public policy from the University of Toronto. Thanks so much, James.
Thank you very much, Katrina, and special thank you to ally and friend MP Ya'ara Saks for her opening remarks at the beginning of our presentation today. It makes a big difference to have such allies in politics and in public policy and in public life helping us out in our work. So special hats off to MP Saks for her intro comments just a little while ago. Next slide, please, Grace. Thank you. So our contention here at CCCE is that caregiving is the next frontier of public policy. What we mean by this is that this is the next big issue that we collectively need to solve as a society, as a country, as a bunch of people who care about each other living in Canada. We've all experienced this in different ways over the years. The data tells us that 1 in 4 Canadians is today a caregiver, and that at some point, half of all Canadians will be a caregiver. I myself fall into this category, like Katrina and others. And Liv, I was born into this with great-grandparents in my life who I love dearly, and I was part of their care when I was very young. As I aged, I took over large swaths of responsibility, particularly in the care of my now late grandfather, who passed away about a year ago. And I continue to be a caregiver for my grandmother, as well as a nephew who with significant disabilities, for whom I'm privileged to be part of his life. So like the rest of our team, I come by this honestly, and that's important because it reflects the reality of the 1 in 4 Canadians today, and and at some point, fully half of all Canadians who will experience this in some way, shape, or form. We also contend that caregiving is essential to our society. So we are collectively leaving about $1.3 billion of lost productivity on the table every year for want of better supports for caregivers. What that means is, because of the various policy decisions that our governments make and that we collectively all make, we're leaving about $1.3 billion worth of economic activity, prosperity, shared wealth on the table that we're not taking advantage of because of these policy choices that we collectively make. Also, unfortunately, that means that about 500,000 people step out of the labor market. That's the equivalent of 500,000 full-time equivalents step out of the labor market because we collectively don't support them sufficiently to do both their care work and their work in the labor market. For a lot of caregivers, that means significant reduction in their take-home pay, which means that a lot of caregivers live close to or at the brink of poverty. Fully 20% of caregivers across Canada report an income of less than $20,000 a year. That is a significant number of people both looking after somebody and living in poverty in one of the 7 most successful and wealthiest countries in the world. Our contention is all of this is unacceptable and that we can and need to do a lot better. We also hear regularly that caregivers are at a breaking point. Fully 87% say that they experience loneliness. About 67% say that their mental health has deteriorated as a result of their caregiving responsibilities, and over half say that their physical health is deteriorated. All of this together puts us really in a crisis of care, where the people on whom our healthcare system relies, and we all collectively rely to do care for the people we love, including ourselves, that those people doing that work are themselves having a lot of trouble and need help from us collectively through better and more responsive public policy. On the care provider side, you open any newspaper in the country or turn on any news broadcast pretty much any night of the week, and you'll hear some version of this story. That we're living through a serious shortage in care providers, which is to say personal support workers, home care workers, direct support professionals, people who support kids and adults with disabilities to live independently, live in the community. We are living through an enormous shortage of this critical work today, but it will only get worse, save for good public policy to dramatically increase the number of care providers that we have today. I'll give you one stat. In Alberta alone, demand for personal support workers alone is set to double over the next 7 years. That's not a generation, that's not even a decade, that's over the next 7 years. Without really good public policy to meet the moment, the already overstretched existence that we're living through right now around care providers will only get worse. For example, long-term care homes frequently report that they're at least 1 to 2 PSW short every shift, and that many of these workers work in precarious work environments. Next slide, please, Grace. Thank you. So in response to all of this, you'll see we put out our Giving Care white paper. This was our first major foray into public policy at CCCE. This dropped back in November. It lays out the landscape of care in Canada as it exists today, such as it is, and proposes a variety of different policy solutions to make Canada the best place in the world to give and receive care. Next slide, please, Grace. Thank you. In our paper, we lay out a whole bunch of different solutions to a variety of different problems within this umbrella of caregiving in Canada. We bucketed broadly into 5 different categories. I'm not going to go into each of these in depth because we're running out of time, but happy to have this conversation with anybody who is eager to have this conversation. But we talk about the need for a coordinated approach to caring. We talk about the need for more and better funded and fully supported services, both for caregivers and care providers, like respite services, like access to therapies and things like that. Third, we talk about strategies to support working caregivers, which is to say how to support the fully 50% of caregivers across Canada who both look after somebody they love and also carry on a full or part-time job. There's a lot of work to be done here around how we can support people to do both. Our 4th bucket is around financial supports for caregivers. In some parts of the world, even in some parts of Canada, caregivers are given dedicated financial support as part of their existence as a caregiver. We postulate that this is something worth examining, as well as within that bucket, looking at the variety of different tax credits and benefits and leaves that exist today, mostly under federal jurisdiction, to support caregivers. The specific ask that we already have out in the field on this is to have the Canada Caregiver Credit converted from a non-refundable to a refundable tax credit. This is already in the government's mandate letters, from the Prime Minister's mandate letter to Minister Freeland, his Minister of Finance, and I personally and all of us around here are pushing the government hard to get that done. The last bucket is around investing and developing in the care provider workforce. That workforce shortage that I mentioned just a second ago, that's part of it, but also, as Liv mentioned earlier, how to turn care provider jobs into care provider careers with a job ladder, with better salaries, with more job security, benefits, retirement savings, and the like. So these are 5 discrete but interconnected areas where we feel better policy is possible and in fact necessary if we're going to do better as the next frontier of public policy in Canada. Next slide, please, Grace. Thank you. So here's a snapshot of some of the many meetings that Liv and I have had over the last few months with elected officials of all parties. We've started at the federal order of government. You'll see a second from the left at the top. There's MP Ya'ara Saks in the conversation I had with her recently. But what I've been doing is meeting with the Liberals, Conservatives, NDP, the Greens, and working on the block to get our message of caregiving as the next frontier of public policy to them, to discuss the need for a national caregiving strategy, and also to specifically push for the conversion of that Canada Caregiver Credit from non-refundable to refundable. I can tell you that so far, nobody has laughed us out of the room, and we seem to be getting some momentum. Next slide, please. Last thing I'll say here, then we'll turn to the summit, is that in order to advance our advocacy and policy work, we're putting into the field the first ever national caregiving survey. So it'll be in the field in the next couple of months. This will be a nationally as well as provincially statistically significant survey that will ask questions both of caregivers as well as care providers and people receiving care. We want to get a coherent story about where things are in Canada today and better understand what the things that people need and the priorities that they have if they are to continue to care for somebody in their lives. It's early days on this. We're not in the field yet, but we hope to have good data to share in time for our summit, which Liv will talk about right now. So over to you, Liv.
Thank you. We're very excited. We think it's really time to bring together people from across the country to co-create a national caregiving strategy. And that is what our summit in November is all about. Next slide, please. So from 6th to 8th, from November 6th to 8th in Ottawa, and also online for accessibility reasons. It is a hybrid event. We encourage you to join us as we look at critical issues in care across the country. Next slide, please. So we have set up the summit with our summit committee, which again, co-design is close to our hearts. So this really has been a labor of love for a lot of people from coast to coast to coast. We will have large plenaries in the morning, and every afternoon there will be track sessions in healthcare, care workforce, social and community care, work, education, and care. And all of these have been carefully curated by people who have shared their time with us to do this. We also think it's very important to celebrate and to note where we are in the champions for care. So we will be having a gala and awards of recognition, and as we noted, in person and online, and in English and in French, so that everyone can contribute. Next slide, please. Registration's open. Do join us, CanadianCaregivingSummit.ca. Next slide, please. And now we arrive at our Q&A. We're going to turn it over to Katrina to field some of the questions. You can type them in the chat. You can let us know if you have questions you haven't typed in yet. I see we've already answered a few. And Katrina, I think the first question we want to take a look at is from Joanne Katari.
Yeah, Joanna, I believe. And the question, and I think this might be a James question, why do governments find it so easy to ignore family caregivers when we play a critical role in the healthcare system?
Liv, do you want me to jump in on this one?
Yeah, absolutely. You take a stab and I'm happy to join in
Sure.
As well.
Sure, I think it's an excellent question, Joanne, and we hear far too often about this from people at various parts of their care journey about being ignored both by the healthcare system and the social care systems around us, as well as being ignored by their government. There's no governments. There's no, I'm not going to lie to you, there's no easy answer here, but I can speculate and I can offer you certainly what my experience teaches me, which is as caregivers, we are very good at just getting things done. When there's a need, when something needs to be done, when there's a crisis, when there's a little bit of a crisis or a burning crisis, you can always rely on a caregiver to roll up their sleeves and muck in and get done what needs to be done. Far too often, that means that we are so caught up in the reality of care work that you don't have time or energy to think about asking for the next thing you need, or even asking for the thing you need today, because you're there in the crisis in the moment solving the problem. So it becomes easy to ignore, unfortunately, because the work gets done either way. The care work gets done either way by people like us, caregivers out in the world supporting people that we love. We are working on this, though. I can tell you that in the litany of conversations that I have had with elected officials federally so far, the tide seems to be turning a little bit. People are thinking about caregiving. People are talking about caregiving. Every day, it seems like there are more podcasts or newspaper features or books or documentaries or TV shows episodes, stuff like that, that are thinking and talking and starting to have these conversations about caregiving issues more generally. So that's all for the good, because the more an issue becomes in the public domain, the harder it is to ignore. Last thing I'll say about this too is that we have, for better or for worse, we have demographics on our side. When I do my rhetoric work, when I talk to elected officials in government and opposition, and I tell them, folks, you're talking about a quarter of the population today, and eventually one quarter today, eventually one half of the population. Those are numbers that are unignorable. When we organize, when we come together, when we have a coherent message and a coherent set of asks, which is what we're working on in consultation and in collaboration with caregivers and organizations across the country, when we do that, the sky is the limit, because we're all coming together with a shared push. So, Liv, what do you think?
Absolutely. I'll just add to that there's power in the kind of coalition we're trying to build across sectors, bringing together all sorts of disability and aging groups. And those are groups that together can't be ignored. And the other thing about the demographics, James, is that it's personal. Just as it's 1 in 4 in Canada, it's 1 in 4, if not more, among our elected officials. So for many of them, this resonates in a very personal way. And it's not hard to tap into that. And once they identify, oh yes, I'm a caregiver, we can easily start that conversation about what caregivers across the country need and what systemic solutions there are. Katrina, it looks like we have a number of questions about the summit. So I will quickly address those. As I mentioned, our summit is being curated by experts and experts with lived experience as well across the country. But we are always welcome to new ideas for speakers and sessions. So Jean, by all means, get in touch with us if there's something you'd like to see at the summit. And someone has asked how many people will be at the summit. We're expecting between 350 to 400 in person, and quite a few more online. And how will we get political attention? Again, by partnering with elected officials from coast to coast to coast. James, do you want to speak a little bit about the political representation and programming at the summit?
Sure thing. Thanks, Liv. So one of the sessions that we're working on pulling together is to have representatives from all of the political parties represented in the House of Commons together on a panel to basically put forward to delegates, folks in the room and at home, online, what is their parties thinking about caregiving, and how do they think about this? How do they see these issues? If they're in a position to make commitments, all for the better as well. Let's get into that as well. But we're starting with the premise of this is the next frontier of public policy. We're getting it to the point where all the parties and all elected officials need to have an opinion on issues of care and caregiving, in the same way that in Canada, it is table stakes for any for any candidate, for any party, to have an opinion about healthcare, education, housing, transportation, etc. So that's what we're building towards. And one of the big sessions that we're really excited about is to have MPs from all the parties there to give their views on this stuff and to really kickstart that pan-Canadian and cross-partisan conversation.
Thank you, James. That's great. I think just to be clear, to make sure that the people know that the chat is disabled, and please make sure that the questions are going into the Q&A. But we are getting close to time. Liv, James, is there anything else that you wanted to add about the summit or anything else?
Okay, I was just going to add, we really think this is going to energize and catalyze movement towards a national caregiver strategy. We need you all. We want you all to be involved. James, over to you.
Thank you. I see a question in the chat about asking how and if the Conservative Party is involved. I'll say yes. If you go back, if you don't do it, Grace, but if you do go back a few slides on this, there are some pictures of of Liv and I meeting with members of the Conservative Caucus as well. And we are working on getting representation from the Conservative Caucus to come to our summit. We're working on it, no guarantees yet. We're still some time away from the summit, but the invitation has certainly been extended, and we're working on securing representation from the Conservatives as well as the other parties. Thanks.
I see that some people have some really specific questions, which is great. You can always reach us because we are running out of time. You can reach us at info@canadiancaregiving.org and we will respond. Katrina, over to you to close us out.
Okay, thanks to both. That was great. And thanks everyone for submitting their questions. I always have lots of questions myself, and it's great information. And again, just seeing the stats are staggering, and the accomplishments that you've been able to achieve in this past year are very inspiring and keep me feeling enthusiastic and eager to keep doing. So thank you everyone for joining us today to learn more about the accomplishments and the missions of the Canadian Centre for Caregiving Excellence, and to hear about the very exciting summit in November. I'll be there, and I'd love to meet all of you. As a caregiver, I know how hard and isolating the experience can be. Having a national voice advocating on our behalf has ignited my optimism, and many other caregivers I've had the opportunity to connect with. Liv, James, and the whole team at CCCE, I'm grateful for your dedication to supporting caregivers and care providers and advocating for a brighter future of care. Thank you so much for the work that you do, and that you include us in that work. That's very important, and we appreciate that. All the caregivers do. We really hope to see you all at the summit. And again, I personally want to see you at the summit. We all want to see you at the summit. Please come any way that you can. And again, send questions, stay involved. We can make change and have our voice heard. So thank you so much for joining us today.